11, the Temple of Marduk and so forth. The king's palace is going to be the scene of the events in chapter 5. And that building has been rebuilt. Saddam Hussein has even used it for affairs of state. But notice how the river Euphrates goes through the city to provide it water in case of a siege, but it also, that water feeds the moat that protects the city. And the wall was no trivial wall. They had chariot races, 4 to 6 abreast on top of the wall. So you're talking 15 miles on a side. So this is a sizable place, and it was considered impregnable, and therein lies their vulnerability, that belief. Now the kings of the Babylonian Empire, after Nebuchadnezzar, of course, had Nebuchadnezzar as his son that established the kingdom, and he has 2 sons and 2 daughters. And his first son takes over for a bit, but he's a bad apple. His other daughter married, but Neriglissar he takes over, and his son, I think, lasts 2 months, and then finally Nabonidus takes over, and he has his son Belshazzar as a co-regent. We'll discover that Nabonidus was he had married one of Nebuchadnezzar's daughters. He is just not interested in Babylon. He's off in foreign intrigues down in Arabia and doing other things. In fact, he had not been in town for 14 years when it finally falls. And that's worth understanding because there's a huge discrepancy. The secular world had all kinds of evidence that Nabonidus was really the king of Babylon when it fell. And that's why the Bible couldn't be correct. Well, they discovered more recently things that point out that Belshazzar, his son, was reigning at the time exactly the way Daniel says. So not only do we know that Daniel wrote that chapter 5 was correct, it had to be by an eyewitness, we know now. But Daniel 5 is the fall of Babylon. Very, very colorful amount of history here. Instead of the Persian army is on the horizon, instead of defending the city, he throws a party for 1,000 of his nobles. And big mistake. The Persian army is formidable and been on the uprise here. But they're having this big party, and Belshazzar does a dumb thing. He sends across the street to the museum to bring out the implements that his grandfather had taken from the temple 70 years earlier and going to use them as party implements. Well, that's just guaranteed to anger God even further. So the party's doing great until they see the fingers of a man's hand writing on the wall. And of course, it's astonishing to realize how many expressions in our common day language come from Daniel. You saw the handwriting on the wall. You've all used that expression. There's numbers up. You're weighed and found wanting. Right? The idol has clay feet. You see, all these expressions are from the book of Daniel, interestingly enough. The experts there can't understand what's being written. They can't decipher it, which is a surprise. But the queen mother, Nebuchadnezzar's widow, is still alive, and she says to her grandson, there was a guy around in your grandfather's day. You understand they don't have any word for grandfather in Aramaic or Hebrew, so when they say father, that just means a forebear. But anyway, she says there was a guy around in your grandfather's day that had the gift to do that. So they bring Daniel out of retirement, and he comes in. They offer him all kinds of rewards. He says, you keep your rewards. Before he gives them the answer he wants, he gives an eulogy for Nebuchadnezzar. He says, now your grandfather, there was a king, because whom he would set up, he set up, and who he'd bring down, he'd bring down. Not like you, Squirt. That's virtually the phrase of his discussion. But then after all that, he goes ahead and interprets the famous event. And what no one knew in the banquet hall, while this was all going on, the Persian army had arranged to divert the Euphrates upriver. So the water level went down, and they slipped in under the gates. They took over Babylon without a battle. And that's going to be important later, but this is going on while the party is going on here. Now, one of the questions that people ask, are there really hidden codes in the Bible? I get that question a lot because of our doctoral work and some other materials we have. And it's in the Bible. Proverbs 25:2 says, it is the glory of God to conceal a thing and the honor or duty of kings to search out a matter. They're definitely, the Bible is full of surprises tucked away underneath the text. There's a form of Hebrew encryption that's well known to anybody that's been a student of cryptography. We take the Hebrew alphabet, the 22 letters, take the first 11 and put the second 11 underneath it, so to speak, and then transpose. If you want an aleph, you use a lamed and so forth. And that's a simple form of transposition. And it's named after the first few letters. Instead of aleph, you have a lambda. Instead of a bet, you have a mem. So it's equivalent to ALBM. Album is the label given to this form of encryption. If you take the second half of the alphabet and put it in backwards, now you take the letters and put the others in there backwards, you get a different set of transpositions. And again, you have an aleph and a tau and a bet and a shin, and so it's called atbash. According to the Talmud, the belief among the Hebrew scholars is that the encryption that was used in the handwriting on the wall was a form of atbash, which means the handwriting on the wall, assuming it was atbash, would have said something like this, except it would be Aramaic letters rather than these letters that they use today. And using the atbash encryption and transposing, you get what Daniel ended up reading to them. Remember that all languages go towards Jerusalem. In other words, everybody east of Jerusalem goes from right to left. Hebrew, Aramaic, Sanskrit, etc., etc., etc. All nations west of Jerusalem go from left to right. English, Latin, Russian, Greek, you name it. So anyway, so remember Hebrew goes backwards from our point of view. Anyway, so Daniel says many, many. That word means, by the way, the Hebrew only uses consonants. The vowels are inferred. That's a way of bandwidth reduction and so forth, but I won't get into all that here. Many, many means numbered or reckoned. And he interprets it. He says, God hath numbered your kingdom and finished it. The way we would abbreviate that, your number's up. Okay? The next word was tekel, which means weighed. Thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting, Daniel explains. And the third word is Perez, which means broken or divided. It says, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. And by the way, in your King James, it would say Upharsin. The U is simply a conjunction, and the Pharsin is the plural of Paris, but don't worry about that in the transliteration. If you infer a different vowel than the E, say an A paras is the word for Persians. So there's a pun hidden in here also that's not brought up in your normal translations. But any cases, of course, is what Daniel announces. And that night, of course, Belshazzar is slain, and the Persians take over the city. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in the next session, because we'll get to Ezra, and I'll use that occasion to explain what Cyrus did when Cyrus makes his grand entrance, and that's a great scene, but we'll hold that for the next session. In Daniel 6, by now Daniel's about 83 years old, and one of the interesting things about Daniel's career is that he rises to power in the Second Empire. In other words, he was the number 2 man, so to speak, or he was high up under Nebuchadnezzar. He rose because he interpreted Daniel 2. He was given great privileges and responsibilities under Nebuchadnezzar. When the Persians take over the Babylonians, he again rises to power. He's the number 3 ruler in the kingdom, and very prominent, even though he's 83. And in fact, he is appointed Rab Mag, the chief of the Magi. You need to understand the Magi for lots of reasons. The Magi were a hereditary priesthood that had the power to appoint the king. In other words, they were a priestly sect. It was religious, and yet it was also administrative. That's where we get the word magistrate from that word, Magi. And but they were hereditary. They were Medes. In the combined empire, the Medes and the Persians, the Medes had that particular role. Daniel is appointed the Rab Mag, the head of that priesthood. Now, how do you think it went over for these Medes to be now reporting to a Jew? They were not excited about the prospect, apparently, because they're the ones, I believe, that engineered this attempted execution of Daniel. And so the jealous rivals entrapped him into the lion's den. The king of the Persians, they had a strange law among them in Persia, that the king could write a law, but he could not change it once it's written. We find that operative here in Daniel 6. It's essential to understand for the book of Esther that we'll come to later, next session. But in any case, the king is tricked into signing this document, and if anyone's found praying to the wrong god, he gets to the lion's den. Of course, Daniel is very faithful, and he is praying. And so he gets into this lion's den. You all know the story. It's interesting that the king himself was upset, but he couldn't change it. And that next morning, he rushes there to see if Daniel's okay. He cares about Daniel. You see it all through this. And Daniel, of course, is miraculously spared. But something that is implied by this and some other writings is that Daniel apparently was entrusted some prophecies that he received some prophecies that he entrusted to a cabal, a secret subgroup of the Magi, that passed it on for 500 years. And these guys are the guys that follow the star to Bethlehem. And there's circumstances around that you need to understand. The Parthian Empire was the rival to Rome. And you need to understand that and who they were to really understand why Herod was so nervous when they arrived and why he was so deferent to them. There's a whole background there. But ultimately, these Magi would follow a prophecy that would lead them to a manger in Bethlehem. And we'll deal with that, of course, when we get to Matthew chapter 2. Well, we've gone through half the book of Daniel. The last half are prophecies. There are the 4 beasts of Daniel 7, Ram and He-Goat of Daniel 8, the 70 weeks of Daniel 9, and the dark side of the spiritual warfare thing in Daniel 10, and the climax of the book in Daniel 11 and 12. It's the final consummation of all things. Times of the Gentiles. We went through, bear in mind, we're looking at history through the lens of Israel. But here, in this particular segment of the Bible, it's sort of an exception. We're going to see all of Gentile history in overview. And it's interesting, there's only 4 empires involved, not 7 or 3 or whatever, 4. Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. Those 4. The 5th one will be God actually setting up his own kingdom on the planet Earth. And that 4th empire will be in 2 phases, and we'll get into that. We went through Daniel chapter 2, the gold, the silver, the brass, the iron, and so forth, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. In Daniel chapter 7, Daniel himself is treated to a series of visions. Daniel 2 was given to a man, and we see these empires as man would see them, bright, shiny metals. Daniel is given a vision of how they look to God, and the subject is the same, but the view is quite different. God sees them as a series of voracious beasts. The first is likened to a winged lion. And he's followed by a bear that rises up on one side. And there's another one that's sort of like a winged leopard. It moves so fast it doesn't even touch the ground. And then there's the last one. Daniel can't find an animal to even liken it to. He calls it the great and terrible beast. And it goes into a phase with 10 heads and so on. And we'll recognize the 10 toes on the one hand, the 10 heads on the other. We're going to realize these things two fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. And of course, the winged lion was a symbol of Babylon. The bear on one side raises up on one side. The Persians and the Mede, it was a coalition in which the Persians end up being dominant. And of course, the Greek Empire was characterized by its rapidity. Alexander, in 12 years, conquers the world. Just a few years. At age of 29, he falls on his bed crying, there's no other worlds left to conquer. And so... But Rome, of course, emerges in roughly 68 BC, and at the Battle of Actium is when Octavius defeats Mark Antony and becomes Caesar Augustus, if you will. And you finally get down to about 284 AD when Diocletian divides the empire. By then it's grown so big he divides it into the 2 legs. In 312 AD, Constantine takes over. He's so fed up with the politics in Rome, he moves the capital of the world to Byzantium, calls it Constantinople, the new Rome. And it endures till the end of the 15th century when the Muslims finally run it over. In 476, the Western Empire, of course, breaks into pieces, and every element's had its day in the sun. But let's go to Daniel 8, the ram and the he-goat. Oh, and by the way, Daniel 7 describes the final empire